Today I want to share with you a very effective and surprisingly aggressive system that you can use as black against the London system. When white begins the game by advancing the pawn to d4, and you reply with the knight to f6, a typical London player will immediately develop the bishop to f4. This is the first step of their setup. By placing the bishop outside the pawn chain early, they prepare to play pawn to e3 without restricting the bishop's activity. After that, white usually advances the pawn to c3, completing a very solid and stable pawn structure in the center of the board. This pawn chain, formed by the pawns on d4, e3, and c3, makes it extremely hard for black to find active play. That is why so many players love the London system as white. It is simple, universal, and quite safe. And for the same reason, black players often find it frustrating to deal with, because very few weaknesses appear in white's setup. But today, I have prepared an opening idea for black that is not widely known, yet has even been used by Garry Kasparov. It is aggressive, practical, and catches many London players completely by surprise. Normally, the game continues with black playing pawn to d5 or another standard developing move, and white responds with knight to f3. After moves like pawn to e6 and pawn to e3, white reaches their usual London structure. No matter what black plays, London players stick to the same setup in every game, giving them a lot of experience in the resulting positions. Because the London system is so stubborn and solid, black often struggles to create dynamic chances or find a clear plan of attack. That is exactly why this new system is so valuable. It breaks white's comfort zone and gives black a way to challenge the London system right from the beginning. When white begins with the pawn advancing to d4 and you reply by developing the knight to f6, white will usually continue with the bishop to f4. Everything is standard up to this point. But now black introduces a powerful idea by playing the pawn to c6. I really like this move because it prepares a very aggressive follow-up. Black aims to bring the queen out to b6 and immediately place pressure on the pawn sitting on b2. At first glance, you might think, in the opening it's usually risky to bring the queen out too early because it can be attacked. That's true, and it's good to understand that principle. However, there is another classical rule in chess. Knights should be developed before bishops. In the London system, white breaks that rule by developing the bishop early. By choosing this aggressive approach, black sends a strong message. You broke an opening rule, and I am going to challenge your setup immediately. That is why the queen move to b6 is so uncomfortable for white. It takes advantage of white's early bishop development, puts direct pressure on b2, and forces white to start making defensive decisions right away, something London players are not used to this early in the game. In this position, white might choose to play the pawn to a 3 or develop the knight, but it does not really change black's plan. One of the biggest strengths of this system for black is that it works like a flexible setup. You will see that no matter which variation white chooses, you will generally follow the same sequence of moves. This consistency makes the system easy to use and very effective. After you bring the queen to b6, the pawn on b2 comes under direct attack. Although it may look like a simple threat, it is actually very irritating for white to deal with. For example, if white tries to defend the pawn by moving the queen to c1, it is an extremely passive and uncomfortable move. Normally, you would never want to use such a powerful piece simply to guard a single pawn. Forcing white's queen into such a defensive and unambitious role already gives black a small psychological and positional victory. Furthermore, having the queen stuck on c1 disrupts white's natural development. It blocks coordination and interferes with white's overall harmony on the board. This is why the move queen to c1 is far from ideal for white. If white looks for another solution, they might try advancing the pawn to b3, yes? This does defend the pawn on b2, but it comes with serious drawbacks. The London system is built around a very solid and connected pawn structure, and by moving the pawn from b2 to b3, white weakens key dark squares on the queen side and damages the integrity of their setup. This single move almost completely breaks the classical London pawn chain and creates long-term weaknesses that black can exploit later in the game. Playing the pawn to b3 completely disrupts white's typical London system structure. The entire idea of the London is to create a rock-solid pawn chain where every pawn supports the others, forming a sturdy barrier that is difficult for black to break. But, by pushing the pawn to b3, white loses this stability. The move creates multiple weaknesses along the diagonal and exposes several dark squares on the queen side. Because the bishop has already moved to f4, these weaknesses become even more serious. If the bishop were still on c1, white could cover those dark square holes and maintain structural integrity. But with the bishop already developed, the queenside dark squares become exposed, and black can target them throughout the game. So even though the move pawn to b3 technically defends the pawn on b2, it introduces many long-term positional problems that black will continue to exploit. Now, assuming white chooses the move pawn to b3, the most common response, you continue with the pawn to d6. This begins black's second major plan in the position. After pressuring the weak pawn on the b-file, black now aims to challenge white's development by targeting the overextended bishop on f4. From here, black is ready to continue with an aggressive plan, taking full advantage of both the structural weaknesses white has created and the misplaced position of the bishop. White's bishop on f4 is active, but it is also exposed. Black's next goal is to exploit this by bringing the knight to h5 and directly challenging the bishop. Some players might argue that capturing the bishop is just an exchange, so why focus on it? However, the bishop is generally more powerful than the knight, especially in open or semi-open positions. By forcing white to give up this bishop, black actually gains a small but meaningful advantage. This exchange becomes even more valuable because white has already created structural weaknesses, particularly on the dark squares. By pushing the pawn to b3, the dark square bishop is the only piece that could properly defend those weak squares. Eliminating it leaves white vulnerable for the rest of the game. The move pawn to d6 supports this plan by removing one of the bishop's retreat squares and preparing the knight jump to h5. When white develops the knight to f3, it seems natural, but it also has a hidden downside. It blocks the queen's diagonal. This means that once black plays the knight to h5, white cannot capture it. Now black can attack the bishop freely, begin forcing the exchange, and continue to build pressure on the weakened queenside and dark squares. Once black places the knight on h5, the plan is simple: attack and capture the bishop on f4. At this point, the bishop has no safe square to retreat to. In the most common line, white moves the bishop to g3 black, then captures it, reaching the main structure that this system aims for. If white tries to be clever and avoid the trade by playing the bishop to g5 instead, the overall strategy does not change. Black simply continues chasing the bishop. First, play the pawn to h6 to force the bishop back. When it retreats, black continues with the pawn to g5, driving the bishop to g3 once it arrives there. Black captures it just as in the main line. The sequence may be slightly longer, but the result is the same. The bishop is removed, and black gets the desired position. White has one last resource to complicate things. Instead of retreating the bishop, white may try knight to d2, aiming to recapture on h5 and disrupt black's kingside pawn structure. But black shouldn't rush to take the bishop here. The strongest plan is to calmly pull the knight back to g7, then reroute it to f5. Once the knight lands on f5, the bishop is completely trapped with no safe squares left, and black can pick it up at the right moment. Meanwhile, the white knight on d2 turns into a dead piece, clumsy, blocking development and contributing nothing to the position overall. No matter which escape attempt white chooses, the result remains the same. Black successfully trades off the bishop on f4 and gains long-term advantages on the weakened dark squares. Thanks for watching. Now you know how to punish the London system and take control from move 1. Try it in your next game and watch your opponents crumble.